Good morning. This is January 22nd, and I gave a talk at the Ali meeting yesterday in which I talked about a definition of terms as well as Israel-Gaza. And today I will pretty much confine my comments on the rest of the Middle East and the situation there. I just want to repeat a couple of things so we're on the same page. One of them is to say that when people refer to Arab states, they refer to states where people speak Arabic. Arabic is a language, so people who are Arabs speak Arabic. There are people who are Muslims who do not speak Arabic. For example, Iran, which is not an Arabic country because people speak Persian and therefore are not considered Arabs. They are Iranians who also happen to be of a similar religion as other people in the region. The dominant religions in the region are the Sunni Muslims and the Shiite Muslims. And before I talk about that for a second, let me also repeat and remind that there are something almost close to 200 billion Muslims in the world, and almost all of them are not in the Middle East. We get the impression that the Muslim world is the Middle East world. In point of fact, the largest countries of people who adhere to the Quran and Islamic religion live in places like Indonesia, which is the most popular Islamic country, and places like Pakistan, etc. So we often get the impression, that Arabs are by definition Muslims. Not necessarily. Most Arabs are in fact Muslims. Some are Shiites and some are Sunnis. But there you can be a Christian Arab because you're Arab speaking. So I wanted to clarify that. And then I want to say something about the population size of the rest of the country so we have a sense of proportion. For example, Iran has a population of about 88 million people. Syria only has 17 million people or so. Yemen, which is in the news, and I'm going to talk about in a minute, has a population of 34 million, which is quite a big country, therefore. And Qatar, which is also in the news, is a very small country of maybe 2 million people. So there are various sizes. People have various religion within Islam. The Quran speaks to everyone, but there are different interpretations of them. So you may say, well, what does that have to do with what's going on in the Middle East? Well, actually quite a lot, because the competition between the Sunni countries and the Shiite countries are quite serious. And when we talk about the conflicts right now and the sides people are taking on the Israeli Hamas side, you have to take into consideration that, for example, Iran tries to help fellow Shiite Muslims in the region. So, for example, Hamas are Sunni Muslims. But Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is a big player and a very powerful organization, are Shiite Muslims, right? Now, they may cooperate under the current circumstance, but they are armed through different means, have different alliances and so forth. Probably the most powerful country in the moment in terms of leverage and military capacity and economic capacity on both sides are the Iranians on one side and the Saudis on the other. Though you can have power and influence without having powerful economies and big militaries. So, for example, Qatar, which is playing every side and is trying to be an intermediary in the various conflicts, is a very small country. So it's a very complicated picture out there. And it also needs to be said that the US is, in some senses, both a direct and an indirect party in that part of the world. So, for example, the US and Iran have had a very conflictual relationship for decades now. First, over the internment in the embassy of Americans for some years, but also more recently over nuclear capacity. Iran is very close to being a nuclear country, a week away, roughly speaking. So if one were to have a Middle East war and conflict, this could get very serious because a nuclear weapon on the part of Iran is possible and could possibly be used. Ditto, in the case of Israel, the assumption is that Israel has nuclear capacity. So one could actually have an escalation into a nuclear conflict in the Middle East. And much of what is going on right now is an effort to, on the one hand, for people in the Middle East to take sides in various conflicts. On the other hand, for both the United States and others, which I would say at the moment even include Saudi Arabia and Hezbollah in Lebanon, trying to say, whoa, we're all involved and we're all helping one side or another in the Israeli-Gazan conflict, but let's do it very carefully so that the whole place doesn't explode. I'm sure you've heard on the news that in Yemen, which has had a civil war for quite a few years, and where the Saudi Arabia has been supporting the government of Yemen, while the Iranians have been supporting the Houthis in Yemen. The Houthis in Yemen are firing missiles and whatnot and drones onto the ships that are going through the Red Sea, right? Why are they doing this? They're saying they're doing it because of the conflict between Israel and Gaza, and they're saying that they will continue to do it until that conflict ceases or is temporarily stopped for a while or something. So they're getting themselves involved to show solidarity with the folks in Gaza, and at the same time, the supply of their weaponry comes from Iran. So if you're confused by now, it is because it is a very confusing picture. So how does the US get into all of this? Well, the US has military and interests in Iraq, the hangover from the war in Iraq. It has Americans in the part of Syria, which is not currently controlled by the Syrian government. It has interest, it has a military base in Qatar, and therefore has an alliance with them. And it is, of course, an ally and a supporter of Israel in this particular conflict, even though at this particular point, the United States government is trying to get the Israelis to have a ceasefire and to reduce the killings in Gaza. But still, in all, the US is considered to be an ally of Israel, and in many ways has been and still continues to be, including weaponry in Israel, which is US has heavily funded the Israeli military buildup over years, both technologically and in terms of money. So who are the big military actors in the region? Well, Iran on the one side, and the Israel on the other side, but also the U.S. intervention in various conflicts. And so as soon as the U.S. gets involved, of course, the Iranians start rattling, and you have the Sunni Shiite conflict being exacerbated by the U.S. participation in various countries, in various conflicts in the region. This is all incredibly complicated and confused. Some of it is historical and some of it is contemporary. And the fear at the moment is that any moment now, one of the smaller actors in this conflict, be it Yemen or Syria and so forth, could drag the situation or escalate the situation either by intent or accident. So the fear of a major war that would include the United States in the Middle East right now is real and is quite serious. So how does one look at the region and deter some of these conflicts? Well, some of the conflicts, for example, in Yemen, while they're funded from the outside, for example, the Houthis are funded by and have arms supplied by the Iranians, and the Iranians love to stir up trouble in various parts of the Middle East to make their influence and power known. The question then is, who is countering all of that and who is supporting all of that? So let me quickly add the Russians, because you may recall that the U.S. decided not get directly involved in the conflict in Syria some years ago, but the Russians moved in. And so the Russians were supportive of the Assad regime, right? And the Russians did training and produced arms and so forth. Iran has alliances with the Russians. It is, for example, supplying arms right now to the Russians for their war in the Ukraine. So on the one hand, you have all the local actors, some of them in conflict with each other historically over Sunni and Shiite alliances. And then you have outsiders who actually and potentially can play a role by either patting down the emergencies that are arising or engaging, that is to say, providing American military and so forth, or taking a neutral position and watching this all play out, which from the American perspective is considered very dangerous, right? Because then the forces, quite aside from the Israeli-Hamas conflict, all the various sides in any event are engaged in conflict. For example, the civil war in Syria, for example, Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is always, has had wars with Israel, is at the cusp of having conflicts again with Israel, not just because of what Hezbollah is doing, but also Israel is targeting Hezbollah leaders and killing them in Lebanon, and is also shooting missiles into Lebanon. The Hezbollah head of Hezbollah, is trying very hard to say we don't really want another war because he knows that it will be very destructive, and the Lebanese certainly don't want another war. That they're anyway in grave difficulty economically and socially. So you may say, well, Gruhn, you're just babbling from one thing to another. And I'm just wanting to tell you that it's incredibly complex. And any place, you put a little marker and say, well, something has been settled, the complexity, when people want it to have some complexity, it lights up again. So for example, Iraq, right? We were at war with Iraq, and Iraq is now essentially governed by Shiite Muslims, while their previous dictator was essentially a Sunni Muslim and who discriminated against Shiite Muslims. Okay, now supposedly the war in Iraq has come to an end. but the US still has bases there. And in the meantime, Iran is supporting the government of Iraq, fellow Shiites, and they're quite influential in politics as well as arming and so forth in Iraq. So all of a sudden, a few military outfits in Iraq are being attacked. Who are they being attacked by? Well, Iranian support, right, with Iranian support, and a couple of American soldiers get injured. And if American soldiers get killed in Iraq, will that require America to get back into the fray? Well, the Iraqi government has something fairly intelligent to say about this and say that actually we would be better off if all the Americans left Iraq. Well, they actually would be. That is to say, they would not be a target, or that is to say, American bases would not be a target, and escalation would not be a danger. On the other hand, it of course is more or less handing Iraq into the full arms of Iran and Iranian influence in Iraq. Well, America and Sunni countries, for example, Saudi Arabia, don't like that idea. So there are layers of complexities. There are the religious schisms, there are the historical schisms, there are countries which want to dominate, Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other hand. And then there are a small fry like Qatar, which is, a teeny little place with a population of about 2 million people. Much of the labor force in Qatar is made up of people from India and China and Thailand and so forth. So what is Qatar? Well, Qatar, I guess, is imagining itself to be sort of like playing the role of Switzerland, a neutral in the Israeli Hamas situation. But actually, of course, it's not a neutral like Switzerland because, in point of fact, Qatar has helped fund and finance a portion of the tunnels and Hamas in general. Okay, but it is now trying to say, well, yes, we helped Hamas, but now we need a ceasefire, and we want to play this role and help settle the dispute, or at least have the two sides back off, and so forth and so on. Then there is the Sudan. The Sudan is, a big empty country that has lots of oil, lots of riches, and is probably now and will historically become the dominant country and power in the Middle East, both by its wealth, its relatively large population compared to some of the smaller Gulf and so forth countries. And it has a leadership which is seeking to play a role in the region, and a role in the region both in terms of playing an intermediary role, but also to some extent taking sides in the conflict against terrorist organizations. Right? Because terrorist organizations are destabilizing no matter where they are. And if you're the Sudan that wants to present itself as a major actor in the Middle East and in the world, what you don't want is destabilizing terrorist groups here, there, and yonder. So, for example, in the case of Yemen, right, where the Sudan has supported the Yemenis government while Iran has supported the Houthis, Sudan, just before the blow-up between Israel and Gaza, the Sudan essentially was very close to making peace and allowing peace to take place in Yemen. They had gotten some kind of agreement going, and they were very close to saying, Yemen is now going to sort itself out again in some fashion, but we're not going to keep supporting the conflict there. And that was seen internationally as a major, major positive. And I think the same kind of role the Sudan is endeavoring to play in terms of both Hezbollah and Israel and Hamas and Israel by saying, look, we need negotiations here. The stable, serious actors, not just Qatar, need to meet and draw up possible plans to reduce the temperature and the conflict and prevent the US from intervening more than it has been intervening. For example, in the Red Sea situation, where the US has, lobbed missiles and drones into the Yemeni part of Houthi part of Yemen in order to safeguard the shipping, which is of everybody's interest, right? Because a lot of the commerce go through the Red Sea and up the Nile, etc. And now that it's unsafe, you've probably heard on the news, many of the ships are not going through the Red Sea, and having to circumnavigate around Africa to get back to Europe and the United States, which takes a lot more time, becomes very costly. And those costs, because the commerce is on these ships, the cost then eventually gets paid by us, the consumer, who have to pay more for whatever the goods are that are on these more expensive ship journeys. So the Sudan has an interest in not having the US being attacked and in not intervening, the US not intervening more in the Middle East. It certainly has an interest in not having Iran become the dominant power in the countries in the Middle East. And it imagines itself to be able to play a major role, not just in mediation to figure out what to do with the Israeli Gaza conflict, but also, in a sense, to offering itself as an economic contributor to helping rebuild, for example, Gaza, if the conflict is over. That is to say, we know that 80% of the buildings in Gaza have been destroyed by Israeli bombings. The whole economy and schools and hospitals and so forth have been destroyed. And so Gaza, for all practical purposes, even if Hamas disappeared tomorrow, would not be a viable place for a couple of million people to live. Okay, how is that going to get rebuilt? Our tax money from the United States? Well, maybe some of it, but Saudi Arabia is certainly offering itself as a possible source of help and income. Now, the seriousness with which all countries in the region take this conflict, no matter which side they're on, is manifest by the fact that as we speak, there is a conference in Europe under the auspices of the European Union, which includes most of the actors, and trying to figure out how you can get the various warring parties in the Israeli Gaza conflict to moderate their behaviors, to compromise, to have at least a temporary ceasefire so that the Israeli hostages could be released, and so forth and so on. So you not only have the United States being concerned about what's happening, not just in Israel and Gaza, but what's happening in the region, you also have the European Union involved. Now and then you have Russia involved through Syria, but and indirectly through Iran, and the Chinese speak up now and then here and there. One of the oddities of this conflict, which I just want to mention at the end, is that one of the biggest, most important country in the region is, of course, Egypt, which historically has played a very major role in conflicts in the region. And Egypt has been quite quiet. That has domestic reasons. It has, of course, facilitated getting trucks in whenever the Israelis will allow trucks in to Gaza to help. Egypt has taken a very strong stand that the Gazans can't just leave Gaza and move into the Sinai Peninsula, which has been a suggestion. If Gaza is essentially destroyed, why can't those 2 million people move into Egypt? Well, no, I'm sorry, says Egypt, that is not what we want. This is a headache we don't want to get involved with. We're trying to help around the margin, but they are present in Europe during the conference and putting their 2 cents worth in. And so they're certainly engaged, but unlike previous conflicts in the region, it was not Egypt who was a dominant actor at the moment, it's Saudi Arabia. And it's Saudi Arabia and Iran coming from very different sides, having very different interests. I think many analysts believe, and I pretty much concur with that Iran actually does not want a war in the Middle East. It wants to make trouble and gain more control here and there. And I think that this is also true of Saudi Arabia, so that the major actors, actually and potentially both on the Sunni and the Shiite side, would like to avoid a big war with the involvement of the United States and Russia and everywhere in that part of the world. On the other hand, various actors, be it the Iranians or the Hutus, who act somewhat have the resources come from Iran, but act somewhat independently on a daily basis from Iran. Those folks keep sort of poking everybody's eye and saying, look, we're here. And one of the hopeful, there isn't much hopeful around on this issue, one of the hopeful signs is that at least the Houthis lobbing missiles and drones into ships have said that they would stop if there was a ceasefire. Now, one can't guarantee that they will do so, but that would actually be rather helpful in not further igniting the region. Am I, at the end of the day, hopeful that a major conflict can be avoided? I think it's 40-60. 60 that it can be avoided, 40 that it can't be avoided. But I think it is really important not to get bogged down by only looking at Israel and Gaza, but by paying close attention to what's happening in the rest of the Middle East, because everybody has their finger in the pie, so to speak, for reasons of their own, good, bad, and indifferent. And it is a very combustible part of the world. Let us all keep our fingers crossed that you're not going to have what would resemble almost a world war over the Middle East, and that sanity will prevail, and that the intermediaries can find ways for people to back off. And that is true both of the Gazans, Hamas, and the Israelis. The Prime Minister of Israel has to say they're going to stick around and bomb and whatever Gaza until all the tunnels are gone. Well, if that happens, you would probably have a conflict in the Middle East before a year or two goes by until that is fully happening. So people will have to back up and will have to make compromises. And compromises are always, in the interest of someone and not in the other. But everybody's best guess, and I share this, is that as sort of involved and dangerous as Iran's activities are in various parts of the Middle East, that I think that they would love to avoid a major conflict as well. But, wanting to avoid a conflict is not the same as actually avoiding it, because missteps can be made that will then lead to escalation. We know this from history. So thank you very much for listening. There's a lot to watch and listen to and read about on this matter, and it's very complex. And we need, unfortunately, to keep on top of the complexity to understand what's going on in that part of the world. See you again in 2 weeks.